David sat across from Commander Navarra in a private chamber within the Zalian embassy. The tension in the room was almost palpable, heavy and stifling like the thick, artificial air being circulated through the life support systems of the building. They had spent the last several days in formal meetings, surrounded by Zalian and human diplomats, their every word scrutinized as if the fate of the galaxy hinged on their ability to get along. And perhaps it did, but now they were alone, or as alone as they could be under the circumstances. David wasn't naive. He knew they were still being watched, even if the monitoring was more discreet. The eyes of two entire species were upon them, and the pressure weighed on him like the planet's own oppressive gravity. Navarra sat before him, her elongated frame as rigid and unyielding as her reputation suggested. Her armor, sleek, dark, and imposing, seemed to meld with her scaled skin, making it hard to tell where the uniform ended and her body began. The Zalians had no concept of comfort in their attire, and Navarra's armor was no exception. It was a warrior's garb, designed for function, for battle, for intimidation. And it was working. Her dark, glossy eyes remained fixed on him, unblinking and inscrutable, like a predator sizing up prey. "I am unfamiliar with your species' customs," Navarra said at last, her voice low and gravelly, reverberating in the room like the rumble of distant thunder. Her accent was thick, but her mastery of English was impeccable, no doubt a result of the intense diplomatic and military training she had undergone. Everything about her screamed precision, control, and discipline. "This union is unusual for both of us," David nodded, feeling the weight of her words. "Yeah," he replied, struggling to find the right words. "I didn't exactly grow up thinking I'd be marrying a Zalian." There was a slight tilt of Navarra's head, a movement so subtle it might have gone unnoticed. But David had been trained to observe even the smallest details. Her posture, though calm, radiated tension. Her sharp, angular features were impossible to read by human standards, but he could sense the disquiet beneath her steely exterior. "You find us unpleasant to look at," she continued after a long pause. "Your people have spoken of this." David shifted uncomfortably in his seat. It was true. Humans weren't exactly known for their tact when it came to discussing the appearance of alien species, especially ones as outwardly different as the Zalians. Their reptilian, almost insectoid appearance was a far cry from the soft, symmetrical features humans were accustomed to finding attractive. But the bluntness of Navarra's statement caught him off guard. He had expected her to avoid such topics, to keep the conversation focused on duty and the mission, just as they had been doing in the days leading up to this moment. "It's not that simple," David replied carefully, trying to navigate the minefield that was interspecies diplomacy. "We're different. Our species, it's not just about looks. It's about how we perceive each other, how we connect. Humans are visual creatures. We rely a lot on appearance to form bonds." Navarra's large, dark eyes narrowed slightly, a flicker of something passing across her features, something like curiosity or perhaps frustration. "And you find my appearance unsettling?" David hesitated, unsure how to respond. He had been trained for combat, for negotiation, for leadership, but not for this. How could he explain human aesthetics to someone who came from a race that valued strength and resilience above all else? The Zalians didn't care about symmetry or soft features. To them, beauty was found in the hard lines of battle-hardened exoskeletons, in the power of a warrior's stance. Their world was one of survival, and their culture reflected that harsh reality. "It's not about being unsettling," he said finally, choosing his words with care. "It's just different. We don't have the same frame of reference. What's normal for you is foreign to us, and vice versa." Navarra regarded him for a long moment, her unblinking gaze unwavering. David wondered what she was thinking. Was she offended? Or was she simply trying to process the human perspective, to make sense of a mindset so alien to her own? "I see," she said at last, her voice calm, though David could hear the slight edge to her tone. "To us, strength and resilience are paramount. Beauty is found in function, in survival. Our bodies are a reflection of our history, our battles, our evolution. We do not concern ourselves with softness or symmetry, as your people do." David nodded, understanding her point even if he couldn't fully relate to it. "And I respect that," he said. "I know your people have faced challenges that we can't even begin to imagine. Your resilience, your strength, that's something to be admired. But when it comes to this," he gestured vaguely between them, "it's going to take time for both of us to adjust." Navarra tilted her head again, studying him with those intense, dark eyes. "You speak of adjustment," she said, her voice thoughtful. "Yet your people are the ones who demanded that this union be voluntary. You did not have to accept this arrangement, yet you did. Why?" David hesitated, unsure how to answer. Why had he accepted? Was it duty? A sense of obligation to Earth and its alliances? Or was it something deeper, something more personal? He had spent his entire life serving in the military, following orders, doing what was expected of him. But this was different. This wasn't a mission or a battle. This was something far more personal, far more intimate. "I accepted because it was the right thing to do," he said at last, his voice steady. "Earth needs this alliance, and your people need a future. If I can help with that, then it's my duty to do so." Navarra's gaze remained fixed on him, and for a moment, David wondered if she could see through him, if she could sense the uncertainty lurking beneath his carefully chosen words. But instead of pressing him further, she simply nodded, her expression unreadable. "You are a soldier," she said, her tone matter-of-fact. "You understand duty, as do I. This union is a necessity, not a choice. We both have a responsibility to our people." David nodded, relieved that the conversation had returned to more familiar ground. Duty, responsibility, those were concepts he understood. Those were things he could rely on when everything else felt uncertain. "Yeah," he agreed. "We both have a job to do." Navarra stood then, her movements fluid and precise. She was taller than David, her elongated limbs giving her an almost insectoid appearance, but there was a grace to her that he hadn't noticed before. Despite her imposing size and the hard lines of her body, there was something almost elegant about the way she carried herself. A warrior's grace, he realized. Every movement was purposeful, controlled. "I will see you tomorrow," she said, her voice cool but not unkind. "We have much to discuss and little time to waste." David nodded, rising to his feet as well. "Tomorrow, then." As she turned to leave, David couldn't help but watch her go, his mind a whirlwind of conflicting thoughts. This was only the beginning of what would undoubtedly be a long and difficult journey. They were two soldiers, two warriors, bound by duty and necessity, but separated by cultures, by biology, by everything that made them who they were. Could they really make this work? He wasn't sure. But for now, all he could do was try. As the door slid shut behind Navarra, David sank back into his seat, his thoughts racing. He had faced countless battles, survived impossible odds, but this felt like an entirely different kind of challenge. And for the first time in a long time, he wasn't sure if he was ready for it. As David stood before the altar in the vast grand hall of the Zen Palace, the gravity of the moment bore down on him like a heavy weight. The air was thick with tension, the atmosphere solemn and ceremonial, while the dark stone walls of the chamber stretched high above him, giving the space an otherworldly sense of grandeur. Carvings and glyphs adorned the walls, depicting centuries of war, honor, and the survival of a species whose existence now hung precariously in the balance. Every step David had taken since arriving on the Zen homeworld had led him to this moment. The culmination of an interspecies alliance, bound not by personal desire, but by the need for survival. The Zalians were renowned for their military prowess, their entire culture built upon the foundations of warfare, discipline, and unyielding strength. David, too, was a soldier, a representative of Earth's galactic military command, chosen not only for his accomplishments on the battlefield, but for the trust and faith placed in him by humanity. Yet, as he stood there in his ceremonial uniform, his medals gleaming on his chest, David felt a wave of doubt creep over him. He was about to marry Commander Navarra, a high-ranking officer in the Zon military, an alien woman whose species and biology were entirely foreign to him. His mission had always been clear: protect Earth's interests, maintain peace when possible, and engage in combat when necessary. But the complexity of this diplomatic marriage weighed heavily on his mind. It wasn't just the cultural differences between humans and Xalians that troubled him, but the deeper, existential implications of the union. This was a bond born of necessity, not affection, and the survival of the Xalians now depended in part on him. As he glanced to his right, he saw Navarra standing proudly beside him. Her tall, imposing figure was encased in ceremonial armor, polished to a sheen that caught the flickering light of the braziers surrounding the hall. The armor accentuated her elongated limbs, her insectoid features, and her scaled, reptilian skin, all of which marked her as something entirely alien to human eyes. Her eyes, large, dark, and unreadable, bore into him with an intensity that sent a shiver down his spine. He wondered what was going through her mind. Was she as uneasy about this union as he was? Did she resent being forced into this marriage, just as he did? Navarra had been blunt with him during their earlier meetings. She had made it clear that this union was no more of a choice for her than it was for him. The Xalians were warriors, fiercely independent and proud of their self-reliance. Yet here they were, their very survival depending on alliances with other species, including humanity, a race they once viewed as physically inferior and less battle-hardened. David hadn't fully grasped the depth of their desperation until now. The hall was packed with Xalian military officials and high-ranking dignitaries, all standing silently, their eyes fixed on the ceremony unfolding before them. They had come to witness not only the union of David and Navarra, but also the symbolic merger of their two species. Human diplomats and military officers flanked David, standing in stark contrast to the towering, armored forms of the Xalians. The humans appeared small, almost fragile, next to the Xalian warriors, but it was clear that they were equally invested in the success of this alliance. High Commander Razik, the most respected and feared leader in the Xalian military, stood at the head of the altar, his exoskeleton, worn and hardened from years of battle, gleamed in the dim light. His presence was commanding, his black eyes sharp and unwavering as he surveyed the crowd. Razik's reputation preceded him, not only as a brilliant strategist, but also as a warrior who had led the Xalians through some of their darkest days. His voice, a deep, resonant growl, filled the hall as he began the ritual of union. Today, Razik began, his tone grave, we witness the union of two warriors, a bond not forged by love, but by honor, not by desire, but by duty. David's heart raced as he listened to Razik's words. This was no ordinary marriage. It was a sacred ritual, deeply ingrained in Xalian culture. The weight of the moment pressed down on him, as if the very walls of the hall were closing in. He knew that this union was far more than just a political arrangement. It was the key to the survival of an entire species. The Xalians were on the brink of extinction, their fertility crisis pushing them to seek desperate solutions, and this union, this bond with a human, was part of that solution. Razik's gaze shifted to David, his black eyes piercing as he spoke directly to him. Sergeant David Heron, you stand here today as a representative of humanity, a species that has proven itself capable of strength and resilience. You are here not as an individual, but as a symbol of the bond between our two people. This union will ensure the survival of the Xalian race, and it will bind us to your people, to your strength. David swallowed hard, the weight of Razik's words settling heavily in his chest. He had been briefed on the ritual before arriving, but hearing it spoken aloud in this sacred space made it feel all the more real. This wasn't just about him, or even about Earth's military interests. This was about the survival of an entire species, and he was now a part of that struggle. Razik turned his attention to Navarra, who stood tall and unflinching beside David. Commander Navarra of the Zon Guard, you are a warrior of great renown, a leader among your people. You have fought for the survival of our race, and now you stand here, ready to forge a bond with one who is not of our kind. This union is a testament to your strength, your loyalty, and your willingness to do whatever is necessary to ensure the future of the Zalian people. Navarra's expression remained stoic, but David could sense the tension radiating from her. She was a warrior, through and through, but even she couldn't escape the weight of this moment. This union was not just a matter of duty for her. It was deeply personal. She was being asked to bond with someone from a species that was, in many ways, alien to her. And yet, she would do it. For her people, for their survival. Razik raised his clawed hand, signaling for the next part of the ritual to begin. Two Zalian attendants stepped forward, carrying a ceremonial blade and a small vessel filled with a thick, amber liquid. The blade was intricately designed, its hilt adorned with ancient Zalian symbols representing strength, unity, and sacrifice. It was a relic of their warrior culture, passed down through generations as a symbol of binding ties. The attendants presented the blade and the vessel to Razik, who took them with careful precision. He turned to David and Navarra, his eyes solemn. This blade, forged in the fires of our ancestors, symbolizes the cutting of old ties and the forging of new ones. With it, you will sever your individual pasts and bind your futures together as one. David's pulse quickened as Razik approached him with the blade. He knew what was coming. The bonding ceremony required a physical symbol of unity, a ritualistic act that would tie him and Navarra together in both body and spirit. He glanced at Navarra, who met his gaze with unwavering resolve. There was no hesitation in her eyes, only a determination to do what needed to be done. Razik handed the blade to Navarra, who accepted it with both hands. She turned to David, her dark eyes locking onto his. "We do this for our people," she said quietly, her voice steady. "For their survival." David nodded, his throat tight. "For both of our people." With a swift, practiced motion, Navarra raised the blade and made a small, precise cut on her forearm. The amber liquid, the Zalian equivalent of blood, began to flow, and she held her arm over the vessel, allowing it to drip into the liquid. She then handed the blade to David, who hesitated only for a moment before doing the same. The blade was sharp, and the cut was quick. His own blood mixed with the amber liquid in the vessel, a symbol of their shared future. Razik took the vessel, now filled with the mingled blood of both human and Zalian, and held it high above his head. "Let this blood be the symbol of your unity," he declared, his voice echoing through the hall. "Let it bind you, not just in body, but in spirit. Together, you will face the trials ahead, and together, you will ensure the survival of our people." As the crowd watched in solemn silence, Razik placed the vessel on the altar. The ritual was complete, but the bond it represented had only just begun. David and Navarra were now united, not by love or affection, but by duty and necessity. David's heart raced as he stared into the depths of the chasm, which stretched impossibly wide before him. The shadows that flickered along the jagged rock walls seemed to dance and writhe, as if they were alive, the oppressive heat making the air shimmer with an unnatural intensity. The rumbling that had accompanied their journey through the treacherous terrain of the Chasm of Unity had reached a fever pitch, and now the ground beneath their feet felt unstable, ready to give way at any moment. Navarra's steady presence beside him was a stark contrast to the chaos around them. Her reptilian-like eyes scanned the chasm ahead, calculating the distance to the other side. The Zalians were known for their incredible physical prowess, and David had already witnessed firsthand how Navarra moved with the precision and agility of a seasoned warrior. But this was something else entirely. The gap between them and the other side was far too wide for any normal human to jump, and even Navarra's capabilities seemed stretched to their limits here. His throat felt dry, and a cold sweat dripped down the back of his neck. He was used to combat, to danger, but the sheer uncertainty of this moment was something he hadn't fully prepared for. How could he? The briefing had mentioned the trial, but nothing could have conveyed the sheer scale of what they were facing now. The chasm of unity wasn't just a symbolic name. It was a literal and metaphorical gauntlet, designed to test the strength of their bond, their ability to work together as one. And now, as they stood on the edge of this impossibly deep abyss, David felt the full weight of the challenge before them. How are we supposed to get across that? David's voice came out tight, strained with the effort of keeping his fear at bay. His eyes searched the chasm frantically, looking for something, anything, that might help them bridge the gap. But there was nothing. No bridge, no stable ground to leap from. Just the endless void that threatened to swallow them whole if they made even the slightest misstep. Navarra's voice cut through his panic, calm and unwavering. "We jump." David turned to look at her, his eyes widening in disbelief. "Jump? Are you serious?" The words tumbled out before he could stop them. How could she be serious? The distance was massive, and the very thought of leaping across it felt like a death sentence. He had seen her strength, her agility, but even for someone like her, this seemed impossible. Navarra didn't flinch. Her expression remained steady, though there was a flicker of something in her eyes. Determination, perhaps, or maybe just a simple acceptance of what needed to be done. "It's the only way," she said, her voice firm. There was no hint of hesitation in her words, no room for doubt. David stared at the gap again, his mind racing. This wasn't just about physical strength. It was about trust. Trust in her. Trust in himself. Trust in the bond that had been forged between them over the course of the trial, even if it was still new, untested. But as he looked into Navarra's eyes, he saw that trust reflected back at him. She believed in him, even when he didn't fully believe in himself. Before he could voice his objections, Navarra took a step back, her muscular form tensing in preparation. David watched as she closed her eyes for a brief moment, centering herself. Then she sprang into action. With a powerful leap, Navarra launched herself into the air, her body moving with an effortless grace that belied the danger of the situation. Time seemed to slow as she soared over the gaping chasm, her dark armor gleaming under the faint light from the braziers that lined the walls. David held his breath, his heart pounding as he watched her land on the other side, her feet hitting the unstable ground with a controlled thud. She barely stumbled, her movements fluid as she straightened, turning to face him. For a moment, David could only stare, awestruck by her strength and composure. Navarra's eyes locked onto his. "Now you," she called, her voice carrying across the chasm. There was no trace of fear in her tone, only calm assurance. David's heart hammered in his chest, his pulse roaring in his ears. He tore his gaze away from her and looked down at the gaping void before him. The drop was so deep that he couldn't see the bottom, only an endless darkness that seemed to beckon him into its cold embrace. His legs felt like lead, and his mind raced with 1,000 doubts. There was no way he could make that jump, not without falling into the abyss below. But Navarre's voice cut through the noise in his head, clear and unwavering. "You can do this." David looked up, meeting her gaze again. She wasn't just saying it to reassure him. She truly believed he could make the jump. Despite the differences between them, despite the cultural and physical barriers that separated them, Navarre trusted him. She had trusted him throughout the trial, saving him from stumbling into danger more than once. And now, in this critical moment, she trusted him to take this leap. For a moment, David's fear receded, replaced by something else. Determination. He had been through hell before, faced situations where the odds seemed insurmountable, and survived. This was no different. He had to trust himself, trust that he could do this. Taking a deep breath, David stepped back from the edge, his muscles tensing in preparation. His mind was still buzzing with fear, but he forced it aside, focusing on the task ahead. He couldn't afford to let doubt control him now. "Here goes nothing," he muttered under his breath, more to himself than to anyone else. With a burst of adrenaline, David sprinted toward the edge, pushing off with all the strength he could muster. For a brief, terrifying moment, he was weightless, suspended in the air above the yawning chasm. The world seemed to slow around him, the oppressive heat of the chamber fading away as all of his senses narrowed to this one singular moment. The only sound he could hear was the pounding of his own heart, loud and steady in his ears. Time stretched as he flew through the air, the gap below him endless and foreboding. For a moment, doubt surged through him again, the fear that he wouldn't make it, that he would fall into the dark abyss and be lost forever. But just as quickly as it came, he pushed it aside, focusing on the landing, on Navarre's presence waiting for him on the other side. And then with a solid thud, his feet hit the ground. David stumbled forward, his legs buckling under the force of the landing. His knees hit the rocky surface, sharp pain shooting through his legs as he skidded to a halt. For a moment he didn't move, his body frozen in shock and disbelief that he had actually made it. His breath came in ragged gasps, his chest heaving as he tried to steady himself. A shadow fell over him, and he looked up to see Navarre standing above him, her expression unreadable. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the only sound the distant rumbling of the chasm and the echo of their own breathing. Navarre extended a hand to him, her clawed fingers reaching out. "You did it," she said quietly, her voice soft but firm. David stared at her hand for a moment, then took it, letting her pull him to his feet. His legs wobbled slightly, but he managed to stand, the adrenaline still coursing through his veins. He had done it. They had done it. As they stood together on the other side of the chasm, David felt a strange sense of relief wash over him. The trial wasn't over yet, but they had passed this crucial test. And in that moment, he realized something important. This wasn't just about survival. It was about trust. Trust in each other, trust in their bond. They had leaped into the unknown together, and they had made it. Navarre's eyes met his once again, and for the first time since this trial had begun, David saw a flicker of something in her gaze that wasn't cold calculation or warrior's resolve. It was something warmer, something he hadn't expected to see in a Zalian warrior's eyes. "Let's keep moving," she said, her voice low but steady. "We're not finished yet." David nodded, his heart still pounding, but now with a new sense of determination. They weren't finished yet, but they had taken the first step. Together, David hit the ground hard on the other side of the chasm, his body rolling over the rough terrain before finally coming to a stop. The air was still thick with the oppressive heat, and his muscles screamed in protest as he gasped for breath. His mind raced, the adrenaline from the leap still coursing through him as his heart pounded in his chest. For a moment he lay still, His vision blurred, and the world felt distant, like he was hovering on the edge of reality. It took him a few seconds to process that he had actually made it. He had survived the jump. Navarra was beside him in an instant, her movements precise and effortless despite the trial they had just endured. She extended her hand toward him, her dark, expressionless eyes meeting his for a brief second. Her touch was firm but not forceful as she pulled him to his feet, her grip steady. "Good," she said simply, the word carrying weight far beyond its brevity. It wasn't just an acknowledgement of his survival, but an acknowledgement of their success. Together, David felt a small, tired smile pulling at his lips. He wanted to laugh, to release the tension that had built up within him during the trial. His entire body ached from the exertion, and every muscle screamed in protest as he tried to stand tall. Yet, despite the pain, a sense of triumph washed over him. They had made it. They had faced the impossible together and come out on the other side. They had done it not as individuals, but as one. As the two of them stood at the edge of the chasm, staring back at the treacherous path they had just crossed, David felt a deep realization settle within him. This trial hadn't been about strength or speed alone. It hadn't been about skill or endurance. It had been about trust, about learning to rely on someone else in a way that was raw, primal, and deeply vulnerable. Navarra was a stranger to him, someone from a completely alien species. Yet she had trusted him to make that leap, just as he had trusted her to guide them through the perilous terrain. The crowd in the grand hall, which had been watching with bated breath, erupted into cheers, their voices filling the chamber with a booming resonance that echoed against the stone walls. The Xalians, who had been skeptical of this union between a human and one of their own, now roared their approval. David could feel the collective energy of the room shift. A change in the atmosphere as the skepticism that had clouded the proceedings was replaced by admiration, maybe even respect. From across the hall, High Commander Razik stepped forward, his towering figure casting a long shadow across the chamber. His dark eyes gleamed with pride and approval as he regarded them, his voice booming with authority when he finally spoke. "You have passed the trial," Razik declared, his voice resonating through the hall like thunder. "The bond is forged. Let it be known throughout all of Sia that Commander Navarra and Sergeant David Heron are united. Their strength is now one." David stood tall, his chest heaving as he tried to catch his breath. The weight of the moment was palpable, the significance of what they had just accomplished settling in. He glanced at Navarra, who stood beside him with her usual stoic composure, her face unreadable. But there was something different in her eyes, a flicker of respect, perhaps even understanding. It was a small thing, but it spoke volumes. They had faced a chasm of unity together, and they had emerged stronger for it. As Razik's voice carried through the hall, David realized that this was only the beginning. The chasm had been a test, but it was far from the final challenge they would face. This bond they had formed, this union between two beings from vastly different worlds, would be tested again and again. But for the first time since he had arrived on this alien planet, David felt ready. He felt prepared to face whatever lay ahead, because he wasn't alone. The ceremony that followed the trial was grand and filled with both celebration and formality. The Zen leaders, or diplomats, and military personnel all gathered in the massive hall to recognize the significance of what had just transpired. For David, it was surreal. He had been thrust into the situation without fully understanding what the bond meant, without fully grasping the depth of the commitment he had made by agreeing to take part in this alien trial. Now, as he stood beside Navarra, the reality of it all began to sink in. The trial had been more than just a physical test. It had been a rite of passage, a ritual steeped in the ancient traditions of the Xalians. It had been about more than proving physical prowess or skill in combat. The chasm of unity had tested their ability to work together, to trust each other when the stakes were highest, and to form a connection that transcended the boundaries of their species. In doing so, they had earned the respect of both the Xalian people and the human leaders who had watched the trial unfold. High Commander Razik stepped forward once more, addressing the gathered crowd with the same booming authority that he had used to announce their victory. "From this day forward," Razik proclaimed, his voice filling every corner of the hall, "the union between Commander Navarra and Sergeant David Heron will be recognized by both the Xalian people and Earth. Their strength, forged in the trials, will serve as a symbol of unity between our worlds. Let this be a testament to the power of cooperation and trust." The crowd erupted into cheers again, the sound reverberating off the stone walls like the roar of a mighty storm. David could feel the pride swelling within him, not just for himself, but for what they had accomplished together. These were the same warriors who had looked at him with suspicion, who had questioned whether a human could truly be worthy of one of their own. Now, they were cheering for him, for them. It was a victory, not just for David and Navarra, but for the idea that their two species could stand side by side as equals. Navarra turned to him, her face as unreadable as ever, but there was a slight shift in her expression, something almost imperceptible, a flicker of acknowledgement, perhaps. "You fought well, Sergeant Heron," she said quietly, her voice carrying just enough warmth to suggest a deeper meaning. "I did not expect you to adapt so quickly." David chuckled softly, despite the exhaustion that still weighed him down. "You weren't exactly making it easy," he replied, half joking, though there was truth in his words. Navarra had pushed him to his limits, both physically and mentally, throughout the trial. Navarra's lips twitched slightly, barely noticeable, but there was a hint of amusement in her dark eyes. "We do not believe in making things easy," she said. "The trial was meant to test your limits. You met those limits and pushed beyond them. That is a quality we respect." David nodded, appreciating the compliment more than he had expected to. "I didn't do it alone," he said after a moment, glancing at her. "I wouldn't have made it through without you." Navarra was silent for a moment, her gaze steady as she considered his words. Then she gave a small nod, barely perceptible but significant. "You're right," she said quietly. "We survive because we work together. Alone, we may be strong, but together, we are stronger." It was a simple statement, but it carried profound meaning. The bond that had been forged in the chasm was more than just a test of survival. It was a partnership, one built on mutual respect and the understanding that together, they could face whatever challenges lay ahead. The Xalians did not form bonds lightly, and neither did humans, David realized. This union, as alien as it seemed at first, had become something more, a connection that transcended their differences. In the days that followed the trial, David and Navarra found themselves in the spotlight. Their bond was the subject of endless discussions among diplomats, military leaders, and even civilians. The union between Earth and Xia was no longer just a fragile political arrangement. It was now symbolized by the partnership that David and Navarra had formed in the chasm. They became living representations of what could be achieved through cooperation, trust, and shared strength. David found himself spending more time with Navarra, not just because of their duties, but because of the natural rhythm they had fallen into. They had gone through the trial together, and that shared experience had forged a connection that neither of them could deny. As they worked side by side, their bond grew stronger, evolving from mere necessity into something deeper. They spoke more, not just about their missions, but about their lives, their cultures, and their experiences before the Union. For David, it was strange at first to think of Navarra as anything other than a warrior, a soldier like him. But as they talked, he began to see the person behind the stoic mask, the individual who had faced her own challenges and carried her own burdens. Navarra, too, began to open up in small ways, revealing bits and pieces of her life before the trial, the struggles she had faced as a commander, and the weight of the expectations placed upon her. Their conversations weren't always easy, but they were honest, and with each passing day, David found himself understanding her more. And with that understanding came respect, and something else, something deeper that he couldn't quite put into words yet. They were more than just partners now. They were bonded in a way that went beyond duty or survival. One evening, as they sat together on the balcony of the embassy, overlooking the Zalian capital, Navarra broke the comfortable silence that had settled between them. Please subscribe for next part.